So here we have Psalm 107. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those he redeemed from trouble, and gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south. Some were sick through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities endured affliction. They loathed any kind of food, and they drew near to the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them and delivered them from destruction. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. And let them offer thanksgiving, sacrifices, and tell of his deeds with songs of joy. You recognize this is just a portion of Psalm 107. We left out some pieces of it, and I'll pick it up in the sermon itself. As a child, German New Testament scholar Joachim Jeremias described growing up as the child of missionaries in Israel. Can you imagine being Christian missionaries in Israel, of trying to share with them the story of Jesus, of trying to assimilate Jewish Christians into churches? I think that would be a very difficult work to do. But that was his life. He grew up as a child and a teenager in Jerusalem. Of course, he had great friends. They were all Jewish. He understood what it was like for them to live in their Jewishness, in their own home country, in their own home city. And then the war came. World War II occurred. And he had left and gone into his studies and become a professor, and was well appreciated for his study of Scripture, particularly in the New Testament. And when the war was over, he thought, this might be really a good thing to go and visit my old Israeli friends, those kids that were best friends of mine in Israel. And so Joachim Jeremias, this German, had a big question in front of him of whether these Israeli persons that he knew in his childhood and teen years, whether they would accept him or not. He was German, and it was the Germans, the news was already breaking loose, that the Germans had exterminated 6 million Jews during the war. That's not all the exterminations that went on, but that was the Jewish portion of it. He wondered whether they would have anything to say to him about that. And so he went to Jerusalem, and he went to the home of his best friend in childhood, and he knocked on the door, and the door swung open, and there was this man as old as he was, who reached out and immediately embraced him and gave him a warm, affectionate welcome. And then he brought Jeremias into the house, and they went through the house all the way to the back of the house to the patio, the plaza behind the house. And in that space, outside, was a rough-hewn structure, sort of a tent-like structure, but it had some poles to it as well. And it wasn't permanent, it was just for the time. This was the season of Sukkoth, the Feast of Booths. It was an opportunity for the Jews to celebrate by remembering. So they put up these crude tents or arbors as a sign of their remembrance of Israel's wanderings in the desert, back in the days of Moses, when they set themselves free from slavery and they launched themselves as a whole people of God into the desert. And they lived by tents. Never did they build a permanent structure. In Sukkoth, it is a remembrance, a remembering of that occasion. And so they put these in their backyards. When Wanda and I lived in San Antonio, we had a Jewish family that we were friends with through our daughters. They had class together. And they invited us over to their Sukkoth celebration. And we went. It was wonderful. In the backyard was this rudely constructed with just like 1x2s and 2x4s, and it was very rudimentary. And it formed a little covering, and inside the room that was constructed was a table, and it was loaded with food. That's Sukkoth. That is this hospitality of welcome. The same welcome that we think God gives to all persons. but it's embodied by the table. There's something powerful about when the church or the people of God come together and they seat themselves around a table. There's something important that happens in that kind of way. And so Jeremiah saw this, and he understood what the Feast of the Booths was about. And he understood that his host, his best friend from childhood days, was showing the hospitality of God. Flowers were there, and the children had decorated things that they attached to the structure. And on the front doorway, on the lintel of the door jamb, were two pieces of paper, and on one side it said, "From God." And on the other side it said, "To God." And Jeremiah said it dawned on him in that moment, the very startling revelation that we go from God to God, and in between we live in tents. The whole of life's arc is lived out in that structure. The truth is that we find a way of making what Fred Craddock called marking sacred time. We do it through ritual. We do it through remembering that everything in life is a part of the fabric of how our lives are lived. Every experience, good ones, normal, everyday ones, even some of those that are tragic, we are invited into those remembrances to understand them as marking sacred time. We come to believe that all time is sacred time, and all experiences are sacred experiences because God is with us, helping us redeem all of it as a part of a life lived with God. In our experience of living in tents between our coming from God and our going to God, we encounter everything under the sun. Your stories are a lot like mine, and mine are a lot like yours. They're everyday stories by and large. And there are some stories I'm really happy about, and there's some stories I'm really not happy about. And I bear those as a part of the contract of life. The contract of life that says that when we enter into life, this is what happens with us. These things do happen. And so the whole people of God in this particular passage, you hear this clarion call to everyone who is a people of God, and they come streaming from all the directions. I was corrected in the first service. They come from the east. Is that right? And they come from the west. And they come from the north, and they come from the south. And in Jerusalem, which is fairly centered in the country, you imagine the east being all those lowland farmers and people who had land along the Jordan River. You think to the south, and it's nothing but desert and wilderness area. It's very harsh. And then you think to the west, and that's the long sloping grade of earth that heads toward the Mediterranean Sea. And people who live there are farmers by and large. And then the land to the north, which heads toward the Sea of Galilee, they're fishermen and they're villages, and it's fairly well populated up there. All these people begin to assimilate around the temple, and they come for giving thanks. They call out praise to God, for He is good. That's what the psalm says. Because His steadfast love endures forever. It is a calling together of celebration. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those He redeemed. And what we learn from this is that gratitude is our hermeneutical key to unlock life's experiences. We go to everything and we begin to frame or contextualize these experiences in a form of gratitude. Maybe not so much for what happened, but for what happened and how it has affected our lives. And we begin to look to redeem the experiences. Psalm 107 begins on a note of pronounced gratitude. It's a gratitude that's built on confidence, and it brims with hope. It is gratitude that is poetic and beautiful in describing the universal love and care of God. This is the lens that the psalmist is looking through. He's looking at life through the lens of gratitude, the basis for marking sacred time. The psalmist goes on to give 4 examples of how this is done. We actually read one of them, which is the 4th one. And in that in-between of verses, here are some things that are said. The way in which the psalmist frames this idea of marking sacred time. Some wandered in the desert waste, finding no way for an inhabited town. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. Verses 4 and 5. These are persons that are remembered as those who wandered in the desert. He's specifically remembering the time in which the people of God escaped Egypt and spent a whole generation in the desert. You realize how difficult that is to live in the desert, to find water, to find food, to find shelter, even shelter from the sun itself. These are those that wandered in the desert waste. How do we mark sacred the time spent in the desert? Maybe you've had a desert experience and know something about this. Felt as if your life would come to a desolate end. Maybe it doesn't. Have you spent time wandering and felt that you could not take another step? That's life in the desert. The second one is some sat in darkness and in gloom, prisoners in misery and in irons. This is verse 10. This is also contextualized in the Egyptian experience of being slaves, shackled to work crews, being told what to do, being whipped, being abused, doing service to the man, we might say. Some commentators think that this is a reference to Sheol in the Old Testament, which we would just translate as hell. That this would be the effect of what hell might be. A netherworld of anguish and imprisonment. And for their experiences that feel like a prison. Maybe you have one of those in your job or your work, or maybe in your neighborhood or your family even. A prison of the soul where we suffer immensely and don't know how to set ourselves free. How do we mark sacred the time spent in jail? Here's another one. Some were sick through their sinful ways, and because their iniquities endured afflictions. Verse 17. How can we turn our sorrow? How does our sorrow turn to bitterness? This is the inward life that we have. It's devastating when bitterness takes over. Does the body react to the injection of bitterness in our spirits? Yes, I believe it does. Know anybody who's angry and bitter? Who's angry in the kind of way that they can't seem to resolve it? Bitter in the kind of way that there's something that's there they can't quite get over? Whenever anger and retribution overcome our relationships, we inwardly grow sick. We have a hard time having a healthy relationship with others. How do we mark sacred the time spent in the struggle with our anger? The last category is verse 23. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. I love the notion of this from the upper highlands in central Israel, from Jerusalem. It is a downhill walk to the sea, the Mediterranean. There were ships. There was a shipping economy that was there, trading all over the Mediterranean area. And on the immense waters that cover the earth, when you enter into a small boat or a ship, a modest boat or a ship, you begin to realize how frail your life is, your experience on being on the water. You never know when the wind will begin to pick up and the waves begin to churn. And then it becomes a rolling sea, and you and your little boat have to figure out how to stay alive. Ships that feel as though they are mere specks on the endless horizon of God's creation can give one a sense of being powerless. There's some wonderful naval stories in the Bible of things that happen and the way in which that world becomes chaos. Events of incredible magnitude crash down around us in such fury and unexpected damage that we can be caught off guard in a moment of tragedy. How do we mark sacred the time spent lost on the seas? When I was in high school, I had a Sunday school teacher who gave me a book to read, Through Gates of Splendor, by Elizabeth Elliot. Elizabeth Elliot became a noted author and speaker, and I'd heard her before. But I read her story, and it's the story of she and her husband being assigned to a tribal group in the north part of South America. And their goal was to befriend this tribe, and then to also work at translating the Bible into their language, into that tribe's language. This tribe was understood to be next to Stone Age in its ethos, its mentality. It was very difficult. And Elizabeth and her husband Jim were missionaries to the Aucas, a small tribe of Quichua Indians of Ecuador. They and 4 other couples, young couples. Elizabeth and her husband Jim had a little daughter by this time, and I think one of the other couples may have had a child or two. They were all newly married. They were idealistic. They were serving the Lord where they were assigned to serve. They understood the task was very difficult. And the 5 men eventually came to a place where they met 10 of the Auca Indians in a clearing. And we don't know fully what happened, other than the end result that all 5 of the men were killed savagely by spears. All 5 of them were killed, tortured and killed. And so here you have this little campground where the 5 widows and their children are. And they begin to think about, how is it that we are to make our way in the world? She was nearly overwhelmed by it, Elizabeth Elliot. But she came to a place of peace, understanding that there was a presence in her sorrow to suffer with her. This overwhelming sense of God's presence was with her. How, you might ask, did she mark sacred time in these awful days? Elizabeth Elliot writes that she learned that the God of all creation is our friend and full of love. Is that enough? She would say yes. That even in the tragedy and the horror of losing her husband, even in that, she understood how deeply she was loved and cared for by God. She understood that it's a love that watches over us with as much steadfastness that we can hardly speak about it later in words. Years after the tragedy of losing her husband had been widely told, she wrote, God always suits His guidance to the individual in his frame of reference. Our task is to be alert to His signals, through whatever means they may come, and to see beyond the valley the light of the Father's house. There is a truth about all of our lives are tethered or connected in a vital way with the love and care of God. No matter where you are, no matter who you are, wherever you are on life's journeys, you're contained in that love. It is a way of making every context something by which the love of God can occur with us. We mark sacred time whenever we look up from our troubles and sense the sure and steady hand of God who stays with us in our seasons of trouble. We mark sacred time between our coming from God and our going to God. Amen.